Okay. All right. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I am Nikki Galloway. I am the Research Data Management Librarian, and I am joined by my colleague, Maddie Mikovits, who is the Education Librarian. We're going to kind of trade off on talking throughout the presentation. So we'll be watching chat for any questions. So you can feel free to ask questions at any time. As I mentioned, we will also have time at the end for questions. The session is being recorded, and we will share the recording with all registrants, including slides with all of the links. So, but as I also mentioned, we'll stop the recording prior to the Q&A at the end. So if you want to wait until then, that is fine as well. All right. So today we are offering this workshop as part of International Love Data Week, which is an annual celebration of data. It takes place every year during the week of Valentine's Day. This year's theme is Where's the Data? And it's a way to get people thinking about a data's journey from collection through storage and preservation. So if you're interested, the Love Data Week is linked here to the official website, and it has a list of events being hosted by other institutions. We'll be hosting another event on Wednesday about finding data. And if you are on campus, you should check out our table in the Learning Commons. All right, this is a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. We're not meaning for this to be an exhaustive list of ethical considerations, but we're hoping to help you explore some of the facets of collecting, sharing, and using data responsibly. So from what counts as sensitive data to sharing data to using AI, we want you to feel comfortable using the data you love ethically. So as I mentioned, I am Nikki Galloway, the Research Data Management Librarian. This is all of my contact information. You can email me, call me, make an appointment with me online. Do you want to introduce yourself, Maddie?
Yes. Hi. I'm Maddie Mikovits. I'm the education librarian. So if you are at all in any way, shape, or form the Darden College of Education and Professional Studies, I am your subject librarian. So that's my email, my office phone, where I'm located, and then you can make an appointment with me if you want.
Awesome. Okay, so before we jump into our main content, I just wanted to briefly discuss what we mean when we say data ethics. So I think about data ethics as good practices around how data are collected, used, and shared, as well as making responsible decisions where your data is concerned, as well as following any applicable laws, regulations, and guidelines. So those are kind of vague terms, though, as far as what do we mean by good practices and responsible decisions. Words that come to mind are transparency, accountability, documentation, respect. So we should be clear with ourselves, our participants, and other stakeholders about what we're doing and why we're doing it throughout the research process. We should clearly and transparently document all this information as well. And we should also work to become aware that we all approach research within a lens of our own lived experiences of work, education, mentorship, community. This may unintentionally introduce some bias into our work and research. So we should try to recognize and minimize any impact that may cause. So we're going to start with some considerations when you are collecting data. And I always like to start with what we are talking about when we say data. And it's going to be different depending on the discipline in which you are working. It all depends on the context of your research. So any of these might be considered data, including numbers in a spreadsheet, surveys, audio, video, software and code, even archival material and historic documents. Researchers may collect their own data, or we may use data that's already been collected. Data might be quantitative or qualitative or mixed. And data could be observational, experimental, simulated, or compiled. So a very common term we may encounter is sensitive data or sensitive information. And we're curious, if you don't mind participating with us, what comes to mind when you think about sensitive data? And I'm going to try and pull this up.
Yeah, so if you guys go to menti.com and put in the code, you should be able to get to our Mentimeter, is what this is called. Let me pop the code. If you go menti.com, I'm putting that into the chat. Then the code is on the slide. One moment. There she is. Okay.
Okay. Yay.
Yay. Okay. There
Nice.
we go.
Yes. PII. PII. Absolutely. Give it just a minute more. Yes, information that the participants may want to keep private. Awesome. You can keep putting things in there if you would like. Um, when I think about sensitive information, I do think about several of those things. I often think about human subjects research, personally identifiable information, or medical information. Um, but depending on your discipline, sensitive information may include endangered species, agricultural data, and community specific information as well. So I have a couple examples here. So the first resource highlights that calling attention to rare plants and animals, and in some cases, they're very precise locations, um, can cause a lot of other nature enthusiasts to visit the same site. The problem with this can negatively affect, the species and their environment. So researchers are trying to walk that fine line between calling attention to and advocating for endangered species, while also discouraging people from actively seeking them out. The second resource explains, and I didn't know this, that farm machines can be equipped with systems that capture information about farming practices, including things like yield, which may be cause for privacy concerns for farmers. And the last resource highlights a decision that prevented construction on historically significant native site called Rassawek. This was once a Monacan Indian Nation city, but there was a joint venture between two Virginia counties. They planned to place a water pump station and a pipeline there. But after some legal battles in 2022, the James River Water Authority approved a different location. So advocates of historical preservation, they've called for government leaders to involve tribal nations earlier in development plans. And with that last example in mind, we should always consider all of the stakeholders that are involved in our research. In general, this will include you and your team, the institution you're part of, and the institution from which you may be receiving funding. But there may be more stakeholders than you initially consider. So if you're working within a community, consider the historical practices or the cultural practices and the historical context, as well as any environmental considerations. So those couple considerations are mainly for if you as the researcher are collecting data, but when we are finding and using secondary data or data collected by someone else, there are also some things to keep in mind. The first is that we should critically evaluate the data. This includes, where did it come from? Is it recent? Is it relevant? Are there any biases or limitations? Can we find this information? And one of the first, the metadata. So this is the documentation that is associated with the data set. Does it even exist? Can you tell if it's complete? You can also check associated articles, research papers, conference proceedings. I usually like to go to ICPSR to show metadata examples, but I wanted to branch out a bit and show two other repositories. So this one is a repository funded by the National Science Foundation, supporting oceanographic research. So if we just go to data sets, and I can just look at the first one here, I can see it has the title, it has all of the researchers, it has the abstract, methods and sampling, data processing, any additional processing that the repository has done in addition to the researchers, and including information about the parameters, funding, instruments, deployments. So this is a really good place to start to get an idea of what if the data is appropriate for your research. The other one is the qualitative data repository. And we can go to discover data here. We will confirm that I am human. All right, so we can click on the first one here. And again, we see something similar. We have the title, we have the project overview, data collection overview, and then subjects and keywords, any license agreements, additional metadata terms, and versions. So the metadata will look different depending on the repository that you visit or the data that you're looking at, but it's a really good place to start looking at where did it come from, who collected the data, and a lot of that fundamental information. The documentation, as we saw in I think the QDR just had it, was terms and conditions. So the documentation may cover some of this. You may want to use your data in a certain way, but there could be licensing terms, access restrictions, or even costs associated with the data you want to use. So data might be in the public domain, which means it belongs to everyone without restriction. It allows for copying, reusing, adapting, distributing. For example, US government works are by default in the public domain. Some data repositories host data that has been dedicated to the public domain, and Dryad is one of those. So they only publish data exclusively under a public domain license. However, data might be licensed and restricted in some way. So this is just a snippet from Harvard Dataverse, which is another repository. And we can see down here that there are a lot of different types of licenses that might come with a data set. A lot of these are what's called Creative Commons licenses. So the NC stands for non-commercial. So you're allowed to use it for research purposes, but not commercial purposes. The share alike means that if you do make derivatives of this data, you need to share it under the same license that the original data was licensed under. So you may come across some of those licenses, and we just need to be aware of what we can do with the data. The one on the left is from ICPSR, and we can see in red, it says one or more files in this data collection have special restrictions. So if I go to that data set, and it says, click on the restricted data button to learn more. So if I click on it, you have to complete an application. You have to have a restricted data use agreement, the specific reason for the request, and also obtain IRB approval. So if you do want to use a restricted data set, it could be a lengthy process to get approved. So just keep that in mind when you're planning out your research. And then lastly, data storage. So this is important whether you're collecting or reusing data. You need a place to store the data while you're working on it. So things to keep in mind for the best place to store your data is, does your data set contain any of that sensitive information that we talked about? Who needs access to your data? Is this collaborative within an institution or between institutions? That may change where you need to store it. Our IT does have this research storage matrix that may give you an idea of where to store it, but it's always best to, I don't think I can get to that one right now, but we can send out that link. But it's always best to reach out. You can either reach out to IT directly or the Division of Research and Economic Development if you have any questions on where you can store your data.
All right, my turn. Yeah, so let's talk about using tools responsibly. What we mean when we're referring to tools in this context, generally speaking, tools refer to whatever you're using when you are collecting, finding, or sharing data in any way. In this workshop, we'll most likely be referring to software and digital tools, but in your field, this could mean like physical tools, depending on how you gather data, and of course software. Everything is very field specific, so you know best what tools typically go into collecting or storing research in your field. And hopefully the things that we were about to tell you will of course apply to the things that you'll be doing. So, how do you even select the right tools? So, again, first, this is specific to the type of field in which you do research. But generally, please start by consulting peers, consult fellow researchers, talk to other people who have been doing research longer than you, see how they've conducted the research that you are interested in doing, and what tools they used. Um, you might also have to make choices on what tools you're using based on different funding constraints. So if you have requirements from a certain funder to use a certain type of software or something like that, or maybe there are requirements for the software, that might be a deciding factor. Or just like you don't have a lot of money to do this project, so it might be best that you use something that is open source and does not immediately cost you any money, or maybe you're able to use something subscription based. You should also think about how you plan on collaborating or storing this data and um, what that might do for cost, or what might be the most effective. Many people have no problem using cloud sharing software, but it might be best for your project to use something that works on a local network. You should also be careful to consider the data privacy of whatever tools you are using. Does the software or the digital tool have data privacy policies? Do they have terms and conditions you can read? Do any of those affect your funding or publishing requirements? Similarly, do you know the copyright policies of these tools? If you upload something to this tool, are you allowed to upload like data sets that are not original and yours to these tools? How does copyright play into these things? These are all questions that you should consider before you start engaging with the tool, so you know exactly which one is the right one for your project. So let's talk about text and data mining. Um, Before you start doing any project that requires any text and data mining, we always encourage people to know what the requirements are from database vendors and journal publishers. Um, so not all databases are okay with you taking their content and using any sort of text and data mining software on them. Sometimes they are not a fan of bulk downloading a bunch of their content. Journal publishers similarly, might also have terms and conditions for text and data mining. You ought to also consider the copyright constraints of what you would like to mine. It's entirely possible that the copyright holders are not okay with that. And Nikki already mentioned public domain data. Creative Commons licenses don't necessarily give us free license to mine the information in that content. So it's important to look at the licenses and requirements attached to any sort of data we are interested in mining from. You should also be careful of mining private data, of things that might have personal information or maybe data that you need to ask permission to access. It is important to understand that whenever you are combing through large swaths of information, you want to make sure that there is consent and from database vendors, from whoever has produced this information. So that way you are on ethical and good terms with the people who might have produced the data, and that you have no issues when you start publishing and things like that. At the bottom of this slide, we have a link to the Association of Internet Researchers ethics guidelines for web scraping, which is another form of text and data mining. I think they have a better way of explaining this in more lengthy and multiple pages than I can do in this workshop. So if web scraping is a part of your research, I would recommend taking a look at some of these ethics guidelines to see how you might heighten the quality of whatever research you're doing. So we actually have Nikki, can you put down a link into the chat, a link to your LibGuide? We have a text and data mining guide that includes a lot of journal publisher, I'm sorry, a database vendor restrictions and stuff like that. So if you have questions about any database vendors that we subscribe to at ODU and what their policies might be about text and data mining, it's likely on this guide. We have the example here of Elsevier. I took out some pieces of, I think, highlights of their policy. This is also on the LibGuide. So Elsevier is all right with text and data mining in ScienceDirect, but they have some restrictions. So it has to be for like non-commercial research purposes. The users need to register for an API key via the developers portal, and the API must be used to access the content in ScienceDirect. So these vendors have feelings and opinions about this, so make sure you look them up before you engage. Next, a lot of researchers, I think, are starting to look at how generative AI can assist them in their research process. And in some ways, it can be very, very helpful. And also, like the AI landscape is always changing. So, what I'm about to say is just what we would know right now about using AI tools in research. So, before you engage with an AI tool and at any part of your research, I want you to first I do want you to first, like any other thing that we've just mentioned, we're saying this a lot, look at the requirements for publishers and database vendors for engaging with AI. They all have different policies, I think, across the board. I think they're relatively similar. But most journal publishers and database vendors have AI policies by now. And we'll look at an example one on the next slide. Another thing you should look at is knowing the body of work that the model that it uses pulls from. You need to know if there are blind spots that the model pulls from, what biases might have it inherited. This will inform whether or not it might be a good tool for you to use. Georgetown University has a very convenient list. It's not exhaustive, it's not super comprehensive necessarily, but as far as generative AI tools that have been used or are currently being used in any research capacity, this resource from Georgetown tells you what the models are trained on, and you can go investigate what their corpus is, as well as if you have to pay for it and things like that. I think it's a really helpful tool. The next thing I would like for you to consider is, does the AI tool save your history? Do the prompts that you put in train the model at all? Asking these questions is really important, especially if, I don't know, there may have been the idea to use an AI tool to transcribe an interview that you did. However, that interview might have personally identifiable information. It's entirely possible that when you started this project, that person that you interviewed didn't consent to having their data put into an AI tool. So these are all things that are important before you to consider before you do that. Additionally, you want to make sure that you're able to upload content, and by able I mean like legally allowed to upload content to these tools. So we keep talking about copyright and Creative Commons and stuff like that. But if you take an article, let's say that you downloaded from a paywall database and you upload it to a generative AI tool and get a summary of it, it's entirely possible that that will violate copyright law depending on what the copyright holder's policies are. So this might also apply to data sets. It's if you're interested in using generative AI for data analysis. It's important to understand if you were able to do that, if the model is capable of doing that, all those kinds of things. Think about how these models might use your own data and apply that to any research that you are doing. And consider if that will be appropriate for the project that you are working on or effective. And if it is, it might be a great tool. But just consider all of the policies that could possibly go into using a tool before you engage with it. Oh, as an example, so we have the Sage AI policy. It's a pretty, actually, I think it's a pretty detailed policy. It is for publishers and, yeah, well, for people who would like to publish, and then those who might be reviewers on journals. So it mostly asks that you just disclose that AI was used, depending on how you use it, and they lay out what they mean by it depends. They prohibit its use in any article reviews. It's a pretty detailed policy, in my opinion. If you would like to know how to use AI in your research, the Research Institute for Digital Innovation in Learning, or READL, has lots of workshops on this. They are an institute here at ODU. They have on their events page an archive of past workshops that they've run on this topic, and I know that they'll be doing more. So this is a great ODU resource on this topic.
Okay, so the last major topic we're going to cover involves data sharing, um, because it's becoming a more common expectation. So opening up your data or sharing your data might be a requirement of funders and journals that you work with. The U.S. Office of Science and Technology Policy has issued two memorandums that seek to increase public access to research and research data that's publicly funded. And I have a link here to Spark where you can search specific agency requirements. Many private funders also have policies around data sharing, and a lot of publishers and journals also are starting to support open data initiatives. Um, but those policies may not be uniform. So it could range from data sharing is encouraged or maybe data sharing is required. So the presence of what's called the data availability statement within an article is becoming a lot more widespread as well. So these are brief statements about whether the authors of an article have made the evidence supporting their findings available, and if so, where users can access it. But on the other side, not just of requirements or encouragements, data might and it often is collected for a very specific purpose to answer a specific research question. But this data can have value beyond the original purpose. It can inform new research questions and facilitate new discoveries. Some data can be very expensive and resource intensive to collect, and some data, some observations of a specific event, might not be able to be reproduced at all. So sharing that kind of information can really help the scientific community. You may hear about making data as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. So advocates of open data don't necessarily think that everything should be made openly available. There's perfectly valid reasons that some data would not be made public, at least not at a very granular level. Some of these considerations include the sensitive information that we discussed earlier, so specific Indigenous or cultural concerns, PII, conservation concerns, environmental, as well as data that might be proprietary under review for a patent or of national interest. So open data can make research more accessible, inclusive, reproducible, transparent, trustworthy. But there are some things we should keep in mind. And one is the platform on which you are sharing. If you go into that article about the endangered species, that was shared on social media. So there could be serious impacts to your research, the location or the environment when information is shared too broadly. We might be able to mitigate some concerns with human subjects research and sharing by de-identifying data, releasing data in broad aggregate forms, or even gaining informed consent at the onset of the project for data sharing. But there still might be instances where the data need to be under controlled or restricted access. And in certain circumstances, that is completely reasonable. And we want to be mindful of who we're giving permission to our data. So we should always be following our institutional requirements, and we always recommend to reach out if you have any questions. I like to remind people to always provide citation to the data that either you collect or use from someone else. So we want to provide that attribution. Data is part of the Scholarly ecosystem. It is a research output, and we should be providing that attribution. And always, always, always document everything about your project and your data. It describes the who, what, where, when, and why of your data and your research project. This will help both you understand what you did, how you did it, and why you did it, as well as anyone who wants to reuse your data. If anything changes, it's good to document what change occurred and why and when. And before you start a research project, you may want to consider, if it's not required, to create a data management plan, which outlines how your data will be handled during and after a research project. So it may include things like what type of data would be collected, how it will be documented, stored, and backed up, as well as any privacy considerations and provisions for access and sharing.
Okay, so that's we've already reached the end so very quickly. But to sum up everything that we have talked about today, Nikki, I'm pretty sure pretty clearly you can tell that Nikki and I want you to ask questions before you do anything. Whenever I am teaching classes, I think the thing that I say the most is to be intentional about the things that you do. So I often will say, like, be intentional about the keywords you use in a database, but I also think you ought to be intentional about the tools that you use, and in the way that you engage with them. And also in the way that you share your information. So just ask questions and be intentional before you do anything else. And speaking of asking questions, if you're not sure, ask. You have other researchers who are happy to help you. If you were a doctoral student, you likely have an advisor who is happy to advise, or you have librarians. Nikki and I are certainly great resources. There are also subject librarians that may be happy to have a conversation with you. So if you are unsure, ask somebody rather than assuming that you know the answers to these questions. So that is all that we have for you guys. Thank you so much for joining us. We would love to take any questions now. If anybody has them, you are welcome to put them into the chat, or you can raise your hand and ask them, and Nikki and I will be happy to answer.